On March 7, 1945, from the heights overlooking Remagen, Germany, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Enderman raised his binoculars, his hands trembling not from fear, but from disbelief. Through the haze of the afternoon, he saw something that defied every tactical expectation of the past 6 months. The bridge was still intact. One bridge, the only bridge. Every German commander from the Rhine to the Elbe had received explicit orders to destroy all bridges before Allied forces could reach them. Yet there it stood, the Ludendorff Bridge. Its twin stone towers rose like monuments to German engineering, while its steel arches spanned the 300 meters of the Rhine River, marking Germany's last natural defense against invasion from the west. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, standing beside Enderman, voiced the thought that would echo through history. We have to take it right now, before they blow it to hell. What neither of them realized at that moment was that the capture of this structure would trigger a catastrophic strategic collapse in German military history. It would shatter Nazi defensive doctrine so completely that German officers would later refer to it as the moment they knew, beyond any doubt, that the war was lost. This moment wasn't merely about bloodshed. It was about strategic geometry, the cold calculus of warfare. The Rhine was no ordinary river. It was a natural fortress, 300 meters wide, with swift currents capable of overturning assault boats, depths deep enough to drown armored vehicles, and steep banks that could trap advancing infantry. Since Roman times, the Rhine had been central Germany's defense against invasion from the west. In March 1945, it represented Hitler's final hope to buy time for a negotiated peace with the Western Allies, or to transfer troops from the failing Eastern Front for a last stand. The presence of one intact bridge shattered that hope in less than 10 minutes of combat. The context for this catastrophe had been building for months. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, ended in disaster by late January 1945. What had been touted as a decisive counter-offensive ended up decimating the Wehrmacht's last mobile reserves. Over 100,000 German casualties, 600 destroyed tanks, and the irreplaceable loss of veteran panzer divisions left the German armies west of the Rhine as hollow shells of their former strength. By early March, 12 American divisions were pressing toward the river from the Netherlands to Switzerland. The German 15th Army, responsible for defending the crucial sector between Cologne and Koblenz, could muster only 50,000 combat-effective troops against a force 5 times its size. The bridge itself carried a bitter irony. Named after General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's brilliant but ultimately failed World War I strategist, the structure had been built between 1916 and 1919 primarily by Russian prisoners of war. The prisoners had constructed the bridge under brutal conditions, but they built it too well. Steel trusses were designed to carry the weight of military trains. Stone towers at each end housed 3 stories of defensive positions. 4 massive stone piers were sunk deep into the Rhine's bedrock. Originally, the bridge had demolition chambers built into its structure, cavities designed to hold explosives so the bridge could be destroyed before falling into enemy hands. However, after the French occupation post-WWII, these cavities were filled with concrete. When Hitler retook the Rhineland in 1936, German engineers added 60 zinc-lined boxes to the bridge's girders, each designed to hold 3 kilos of explosives. The system was meant to detonate simultaneously, dropping the entire structure into the river in seconds. But in October 1944, an American bomb struck the Mülheim Bridge in Cologne, setting off its pre-positioned demolition charges and destroying the bridge before the Germans intended. Hitler's fury was overwhelming. He ordered the court-martial of the officers responsible and demanded that all demolition charges on Rhine bridges be removed and stored nearby. New orders specified that charges could only be replaced when Allied forces came within 8 kilometers, and bridges could only be destroyed by written orders from sector commanders. This policy created a nightmare for German officers. Blow a bridge too early and face a court-martial for destroying a vital retreat route. Wait too long and face execution for allowing key infrastructure to fall into enemy hands. This psychological pressure paralyzed German decision-making precisely when decisive action was most needed. The American advance toward Remagen, designated Operation Lumberjack, was a modest name for what would become one of the most consequential movements of the war. The operation's primary objectives were the capture of Cologne and Koblenz, two ancient cities controlling crucial Rhine crossings. The American First Army, under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, drove eastward through the Eifel region, encountering German resistance that had deteriorated from organized defense to desperate delaying actions. German commanders had no illusions about stopping the American advance. Their orders were merely to delay, to buy time for more troops to arrive. As the American forces pushed forward across the Rhine, Major General John Leonard's 9th Armored Division, known as the Phantom Division for its habit of being reported destroyed only to reappear days later, led the charge. March 7th began with fog blanketing the Rhine Valley. German command had descended into chaos, a level of disarray unimaginable in the Wehrmacht of 1940. General Edwin von Rothk, who had been in charge of the 53rd Corps responsible for the Remagen sector, had accidentally wandered into American lines on March 6th and been captured. His replacement, General Richard von Rothmer, couldn't even reach Remagen because American units had already cut the roads. At 1:00 a.m. on March 7th, General Otto Hitzfeld of the 67th Corps was informed that he was now responsible for defending the Ludendorff Bridge, despite being 64 kilometers away and never having seen the structure. Hitzfeld immediately dispatched his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, to take command of the defense. Scheller set out at 3:00 a.m. with 8 men and a radio, intending to gather retreating units and form a defense. The journey quickly became a nightmare. Wrong. Turns, American roadblocks and fuel shortages scattered the group. The radio unit became separated. Scheller didn't reach Remagen until 11:15 a.m., just 2 hours before American forces would crest the heights overlooking the town. Captain Willy Brach, the German commandant on site in Remagen, commanded a force that existed more on paper than in reality. Though officially listed as 600 men, his actual combat strength was only 36, mostly wounded, elderly or young boys from the Volkssturm militia. Many were Osttruppen, Soviet prisoners who had agreed to serve in German uniform to avoid prison camps. Their reliability in combat against American forces was questionable at best. Brach had spent weeks pleading for reinforcements, proper radio equipment, or anything to help defend the strategic objective, but his requests were lost in the chaos of a collapsing command structure. The demolition charges intended for the bridge had still not been permanently installed. When the orders to replace them came on March 6th, engineer officers scrambled to place 2,800 kilograms of explosives into the bridge's piers and attach 300 kilograms of shaped charges to critical points. The American approach on March 7th had an element of accidental fate. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Enderman commanded a task force from the 9th Armored Division's Combat Command B, made up of elements from the 14th Tank Battalion and the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. Their orders were to capture Remagen and then head south to link up with the Third Army. No one expected to find an intact bridge. American intelligence had confirmed that German engineers were systematically destroying every Rhine crossing as Allied forces advanced. Photographs had documented the destruction of bridges in Cologne, Bonn, and Koblenz. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen should have been demolished days earlier. When Enderman's lead elements emerged from the woods overlooking Remagen at about 1 p.m., the scene that greeted them seemed surreal. German military vehicles were still crossing the bridge, Civilians crowded the approaches, and the bridge stood intact, with demolition charges visible as dark shapes attached to the steelwork. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, a 22-year-old platoon leader born in Frankfurt, Germany, who had immigrated to the United States as a child, would lead the assault. Fluent in German, Timmermann understood the significance of what they were seeing better than most. The bridge wasn't just a crossing point. It symbolized the failure of Germany's last natural barrier, overcome not through a massive assault, but by a combination of luck and German indecision. Brigadier General William Hogue, commander of Combat Command B, arrived at the heights around 2:45 p.m. He immediately grasped the strategic importance of the situation. This wasn't just an opportunity to cross the Rhine, but a chance to advance 3 weeks ahead of Montgomery's Operation Plunder, which was scheduled for late March. Hogue made the decision that would define his military career. "We're taking that bridge now." The German defenders were in the worst possible tactical situation. Major Scheller had arrived at the bridge approach just over 2 hours earlier, exhausted from his treacherous journey and shocked by what he found. Captain Bratch briefed him quickly. The bridge had been rigged for demolition, with electrical detonators controlled from the eastern tunnel entrance. A backup fuse system could be lit manually. However, the defensive perimeter was practically non-existent. Many of the troops Scheller had hoped to muster had already crossed the bridge or bypassed Remagen entirely. The fog that had blanketed the morning lifted at the most inopportune moment, granting American artillery observers perfect visibility. At about 3:15 p.m., American tanks appeared at the western approach to the town. The time for action had arrived. Deliberation was brief. The assault on Remagen town itself lasted less than 30 minutes. Lieutenant John Grimball's platoon of M26 Pershing tanks, the newest and most powerful American tanks in the European theater, spearheaded the attack. These tanks were so new that most German soldiers had never seen them. Armed with 90mm guns capable of penetrating any German armor, the Pershings embodied American industrial might. The tanks launched white phosphorus rounds to create smoke screens and pounded German positions with high explosive shells. Timmermann's infantry followed, moving through streets scarred by years of Allied bombing. Remagen had once been a charming Rhine resort town, but by March 1945, more than half its buildings had been reduced to rubble. The few German soldiers left to defend the town quickly retreated, many fleeing across the bridge. Captain Bratch, watching the American advance from his position near the bridge's western tower, knew the critical moment had arrived. At 3:20 p.m., he ordered the demolition of the western approach ramp. The explosion created a crater 3 meters wide, preventing American tanks from driving directly onto the bridge, but the main structure remained standing. The race for the bridge was now a matter of minutes and meters. American tanks positioned themselves at the western end, their 90mm guns hammering German positions on the eastern heights. The airfield, a 180-meter basalt cliff rising on the eastern bank, was lined with German anti-aircraft guns, now angled downward to fire directly at American troops. Timmermann's infantry, about 120 men from A Company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, began crossing the bridge around 3:50 p.m. They advanced in short bursts, using the bridge's stone towers and railings for cover. German machine guns opened fire from the eastern towers and from positions in the tunnel entrance beyond. Bullets ricocheted off steel and stone, creating a deadly crossfire. Several Americans fell in the initial seconds, but the rest kept advancing. Major Scheller, watching from the tunnel entrance on the eastern side, faced the most consequential decision any German officer could make that day. The bridge was rigged with explosives, and the electrical detonation system was ready. American troops were halfway across. Every instinct, every principle of military doctrine demanded he detonate the bridge immediately. But Lieutenant Karl Peters of the anti-aircraft artillery had approached Scheller minutes earlier with a desperate plea. Peters commanded a battery equipped with the new Henschel HS-297 rocket launcher system, a top-secret weapon capable of firing 24 high-velocity anti-aircraft rockets with exceptional precision. The battery was still on the western side of the bridge. Peters couldn't let this advanced technology fall into American hands, so Scheller made the fateful decision to delay the detonation. That decision would cost him his life. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the combat engineer responsible for the demolition charges, stood at the electrical detonator in the tunnel entrance. When Peters's battery finally cleared the bridge, Friesenhahn received the order from Scheller. At around 4 p.m., with American troops 2/3 of the way across, Friesenhahn turned the key. Nothing happened. The electrical system had failed. A shell had likely severed the wiring earlier, though no one would ever be able to determine the exact cause. Sergeant Alex Drabik, a 34-year-old from Toledo, Ohio, became the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine since Napoleon's armies had crossed in the opposite direction a century earlier. Behind him, Timmermann and the rest of A Company continued forward. Engineer Sergeant Eugene Dorland and his team began cutting every wire they could find, working frantically to disconnect the remaining demolition charges before German engineers could activate the backup system. Corporal Anton Faust, a German engineer, volunteered for a desperate mission. He ran out of the tunnel, dashing across approximately 100 meters of open ground under direct fire, and manually ignited the backup fuse. The explosion that followed at 4:15 sent shockwaves through the structure. The bridge lifted several inches off its foundations before settling back. Smoke and debris filled the air, and American soldiers on the bridge were thrown to the deck. But when the smoke cleared, the bridge still stood. The main steel arches were damaged but remained intact. The 6-inch sag in the roadway was passable. The bridge held. The race was over. The Americans had won. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, yet controlled by American training and determination. American combat engineers flooded the bridge, working frantically to remove the remaining demolition charges and repair the damage to the approach ramp. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser's 27th Armored Infantry Battalion began setting up a defensive perimeter on the eastern side. Extending from the tunnel entrance across the slopes of the Eifel, German resistance collapsed with stunning speed. Captain Bratsch and most of his remaining troops took shelter in the 400-meter railroad tunnel beneath the town. By 5:30 p.m., Lieutenant Timmermann and his men had secured the tunnel entrance and captured several hundred prisoners, most of whom were relieved that their war was over. Major Scheller made a fatal decision born of desperation. Realizing the bridge was lost, he chose to wait too long and paid the ultimate price. When Major Scheller realized that he bore formal responsibility for the defense of the bridge, he commandeered a bicycle and rode east to find his corps headquarters and report the situation. 4 days later, he would be arrested, court-martialed, and executed by firing squad as a scapegoat for a failure that had many fathers. News of the bridge's capture reached the American chain of command with astonishing speed. Around 5 p.m., Brigadier General Hoge radioed his division commander, Major General John Leonard, with news that was both surprising and miraculous. "We got the bridge," he reported. Leonard immediately relayed the information to 1st Army headquarters. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, who was conferring with his staff at the time, grabbed the phone so quickly that he knocked over his coffee. Within minutes, he was speaking to 12th Army Group Commander General Omar Bradley. Bradley was in a meeting with his operations officer, Major General Harold Bull, when an aide interrupted with the urgent news. "Brad, we've got a bridge," Hodges said, his voice vibrating with excitement. "A bridge?" Bradley asked, standing up from his desk. "You mean you've got one intact on the Rhine?" "Yep," Leonard said, "nabbed one at Remagen before they could blow it up." Bradley's response became legendary among the American High Command. "Hot dog, Courtney. This will bust it wide open. Are you getting your stuff across?" "Just as fast as we can push it over," Hodges replied. Bradley immediately called Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower at his headquarters in Reims, France. Eisenhower grasped the significance at once. The capture represented what he later described as one of those rare, fleeting opportunities in war which, if seized, can have incalculable effects on future success. Eisenhower's original plan had called for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group to make the primary Rhine crossing near Wesel in late March, supported by airborne operations and massive artillery bombardment. The American crossing was supposed to be secondary, smaller in scale, and carefully coordinated. The Remagen Bridge changed everything. Eisenhower ordered Bradley to exploit the bridgehead immediately. Every available unit was to be diverted to Remagen. The entire strategic focus of the Western Front shifted south within hours. Meanwhile, the German response was marked by command paralysis and murderous scapegoating. When news of the bridge's fall reached Adolf Hitler at his headquarters in Berlin, his response combined despair with rage. Hitler had been clinging to the delusion that the Rhine would buy him time to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. The entire German defensive strategy hinged on using the river as a barrier, behind which shattered divisions could regroup and be redeployed. The capture of an intact American bridgehead 3 weeks ahead of schedule destroyed that plan. Hitler's immediate reaction was to find someone to blame and execute them. He summoned General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, a fanatical Nazi officer known for his ruthlessness on the Eastern Front. Hübner was put in charge of a flying special court-martial, with orders to try and execute the officers responsible for losing the bridge. The court-martial was a legal farce, a traveling execution squad disguised as a judicial process. Hübner was accompanied by 2 lieutenant colonels and 2 military policemen, who served as the firing squad. None of them had legal training, and Hübner rejected any offers of copies of the German military code of justice, claiming that Hitler's personal order was all the authority he needed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aristocratic commander of all German forces in the West, was dismissed from his position on March 10th. Hitler's paranoia demanded a scapegoat of appropriate rank, so von Rundstedt was replaced by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, hastily transferred from command in Italy. Kesselring was a capable defensive tactician, known as Hitler's firefighter for his ability to stabilize deteriorating situations. But even Kesselring realized that the situation at Remagen was beyond saving. He later described the loss of the bridge as the Crime of Remagen, stating that it broke the front along the Rhine and made sustained defense impossible. Hermann Göring, commander of the rapidly disintegrating Luftwaffe, was even more blunt, declaring that the capture of the bridge made a prolonged defense untenable. The psychological impact was profound. German officers, who had still clung to the hope of holding the Rhine, now understood that the war had entered its final phase. The flying court-martial went to work with brutal efficiency. General Major Richard von Bothmer, who had nominal command of the Bonn and Remagen sector but had never even reached the bridge, was tried on March 9th. He was convicted of dereliction of duty, demoted to private, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Von Bothmer, whose wife had died and whose son had been killed in the war, grabbed a pistol from a court official and shot himself in the courtroom on March 10th. On March 11th, the court-martial arrived at Field Marshal Model's Army Group B headquarters. 4 officers were tried that day, and their fates were sealed by the brutal demands of Hitler's regime. The proceedings lasted less than an hour for each officer. Major Hans Scheller was convicted for failing to blow the bridge, despite having arrived only 2 hours before the American assault and having done everything humanly possible under impossible circumstances. Lieutenant Karl Peters was convicted for allowing his secret rocket launcher to fall into American hands, despite his repeated requests for time to move his equipment across. Major August Kraft and Major Herbert Strobel, the combat engineers who had laid the original charges days earlier and were 60 kilometers away when the bridge was captured, were convicted for insufficient preparation of the demolition system. All 4 men were sentenced to death. The executions took place on March 14, 1945, in the forests near the small villages of Rimbach and Oberebach. The 4 officers were led into the woods, forced to kneel, and shot in the back of the neck. Their bodies were left in unmarked shallow graves where they fell. Captain Willy Bratka, who had actually commanded the bridge defense and had done more than anyone to prepare for its demolition, was tried in absentia and also sentenced to death. However, Bratka was already an American prisoner, captured in the tunnel on March 7th. Captain Karl, the engineer who had attempted to detonate the charges, was also in American custody. Zenon was tried in absentia and acquitted, a rare moment of judicial rationality amidst the chaos. Field Marshal Model personally endorsed the executions and ordered that news of them be distributed to every unit in the German military as a warning. The message was clear. Failure would be punished by death, regardless of the circumstances. While German officers were being executed for losing the bridge, American forces were flooding across it in numbers that increased by the hour. The bridge itself remained standing, though clearly damaged. Engineers worked around the clock to shore up weakened sections and repair the approach ramp. A combat engineer battalion erected lights for nighttime traffic. Military police directed the flow of men and vehicles. Within 24 hours of the capture, more than 8,000 American troops had crossed into the bridgehead on the eastern bank. Tank companies, artillery batteries, and infantry battalions were all flowing across the only intact Rhine Bridge between Switzerland and the North Sea. But the Americans knew the bridge could collapse at any moment. Combat engineers began constructing tactical bridges immediately. By March 9th, just 48 hours after the capture, the first tactical bridge was completed. An M1940 aluminum alloy treadway bridge was erected just north of the Ludendorff Bridge. Work on a second pontoon bridge began soon after. The American plan was to solidify the bridgehead and make it irreversible. No matter what happened to the original structure, the German response to the bridgehead was everything Hitler's strategic reserves could muster, which by March 1945 meant a collection of ad hoc battle groups formed from shattered divisions and rear echelon units. The Luftwaffe, which had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength, launched repeated airstrikes against the bridge. Over the next 10 days, American intelligence tracked 367 separate German air sorties targeting the Remagen area. The Americans responded by assembling the largest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery in the European theater. 5 anti-aircraft battalions, armed with hundreds of guns, created a defensive perimeter around the bridge. The anti-aircraft battles became some of the most intense of the war. American gunners claimed to have shot down more than 100 German aircraft. In the 10 days following the bridge's capture, the Germans deployed their most advanced technology in desperate attempts to destroy the bridge. The Arado R-234 jet bombers, the world's first operational jet bombers, attacked in high-speed dives exceeding 800 km/h, though the jets were nearly impossible to intercept. Their bombing accuracy at such high speeds was poor, and most bombs missed the bridge. The Germans also sent the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Faster than anything the Allies could field, the Me-262 represented the pinnacle of German technological innovation. But despite their advanced technology, the Germans faced too many limitations. Too few aircraft, too little fuel, and too few experienced pilots. The German air attacks inflicted casualties and damage, but failed to destroy either the original bridge or the tactical bridges being built alongside it. Hitler personally authorized the use of V-2 rockets against the bridge, marking the first and only time these strategic weapons were used against a tactical target. The V-2, a ballistic missile that reached speeds exceeding 5,000 km/h, was originally designed to terrorize London, not hit precise military targets. 11 V-2s were launched at Remagen from sites in the Netherlands, 130 kilometers away. The rockets killed a handful of American soldiers and an unknown number of German civilians in nearby towns. But none hit the bridge. The Germans also sent frogmen down the Rhine, 7 naval demolition specialists wearing Italian-made underwater breathing apparatus. The Americans detected them using canal defense lights, a secret technology that projected intense beams of light across the water. All 7 frogmen were either killed or captured. The Germans also floated explosive-laden boats down the river, disguised as logs, and deployed the Kalesgrit, a 600mm super-heavy siege mortar that fired shells weighing over 150 kilograms. Despite all these efforts, the bridge held firm, and the Americans continued to expand their bridgehead across the Rhine. The Kalesgrit was one of the largest artillery pieces ever constructed, capable of firing shells weighing 2 tons. Its shells could demolish fortifications in a single hit, but its accuracy was limited, and moving the massive weapon into position took days. The few shells that were fired at the bridge missed their mark. The psychological impact of all this German effort had the opposite effect of what Hitler intended. Every failed attack on the bridge reinforced American morale while underscoring German desperation. American soldiers fighting in the bridgehead understood they were witnessing the final stages of the Wehrmacht's collapse. German soldiers saw it too. Prisoners captured in the fighting expressed relief that their war was over, many having expected orders for a counterattack, knowing those orders would lead to suicide missions. The American presence across the Rhine destroyed any remaining hope that Germany could avoid total defeat. The strategic situation was starkly simple. With American forces already across the Rhine in strength, the river had lost its function as a defensive barrier. Every German division assigned to contain the Remagen bridgehead was a division unavailable for the massive Allied crossing scheduled for late March. The German defensive line was rapidly disintegrating under pressure. Major General Karl Wagner, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Walter Model, later summarized the impact of Remagen with remarkable clarity. He stated in post-war interrogations, "The Remagen affair caused a great feeling of guilt and shame among the German command. It demonstrated that the Allies now held complete initiative, and German forces could only react. Never seize the advantage." The failure to destroy the bridge symbolized the complete collapse of German command and control, highlighting the inability to carry out even basic military operations by officers trained in the Prussian tradition of military excellence. This failure cut deeply, not merely as a tactical defeat, but as a moral collapse. It was proof that the Wehrmacht, which had conquered much of Europe in 1940, had disintegrated beyond recognition. The bridge collapsed on March 17th at approximately 3 p.m. The structure had withstood 10 days under conditions no engineer had anticipated. American traffic had been continuous, with thousands of vehicles crossing and recrossing. German artillery had scored direct hits and near misses. Air attacks had caused cumulative damage. The vibrations from nearby explosions had stressed metal fatigued by decades of use and the failed German demolition attempt on March 7th. Witnesses reported hearing rivets popping like gunshots in the moments before the collapse. A vertical hanger on the southern arch snapped, followed by another. The entire center span lifted briefly before falling into the Rhine with a deafening roar that could be heard for kilometers. American combat engineers died in the collapse, with over 60 injured. Most were members of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, who had been working on repairs at the moment of failure. The irony was bitter. The men who had saved the bridge through their frantic efforts to disarm German demolition charges now died because their repairs couldn't overcome the accumulated damage. But by the time the bridge fell, it had already become strategically irrelevant. American engineers had completed 2 tactical bridges and were finishing a third. Pontoon bridges, treadway bridges, and Bailey bridges now spanned the Rhine at multiple points near Remagen. More than 25,000 American troops had crossed the damaged Ludendorff Bridge before it fell. After its collapse, The rate of crossing actually increased because the tactical bridges could handle heavier traffic. By March 25th, just 18 days after the initial capture of the bridge, over 125,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine at Remagen. 6 entire divisions, along with their tanks, artillery and supply trains, had established themselves on the eastern bank. The bridgehead was 8 miles deep and 25 miles wide, encompassing 11 kilometers of critical autobahn, connecting the Ruhr industrial region with Frankfurt. American forces were poised to drive deep into central Germany. The breakout from the Remagen bridgehead began on March 25th. American armored divisions, which had been constrained by the narrow perimeter of the bridgehead, suddenly surged eastward. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division covered 108 kilometers in a single day. Combat Command A advanced 110 kilometers in just 11 hours. German resistance, which had been fierce within the confines around the bridge, quickly evaporated across the wider front. Entire German units surrendered rather than face annihilation. On March 29th, Combat Command A captured more than 200 prisoners in a single engagement. The American advance was so swift that German commanders lost track of their own units. Field Marshal Model's Army Group B, which had numbered approximately 325,000 men before the Remagen breakout, began to disintegrate. Divisions lost contact with Corps headquarters. Corps lost contact with Army commands. The command structure that had held the Wehrmacht together for 5 years of war was coming apart. The strategic implications reverberated throughout the German defensive system. Field Marshal Model found himself commanding an army group that was simultaneously trying to defend against the Remagen bridgehead, contain American forces breaking out from other Rhine crossing points, and prevent the encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region. All 3 objectives were impossible to achieve with the available forces. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart and the source of 80% of its coal and steel production, was about to be cut off. Model knew that losing the Ruhr meant losing any chance of sustaining war production. Without coal and steel, the Wehrmacht could no longer replace losses, fuel its vehicles, or produce ammunition. The loss of Remagen Bridge had set the stage for the loss of the Ruhr, and the loss of the Ruhr meant the end of the war. By March 31st, 3 weeks after the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge, all 4 American armies operating on the Western Front had crossed the Rhine. What had been anticipated as a crossing requiring elaborate amphibious operations, massive casualties and weeks of fighting, had been accomplished with astonishing speed. The Rhine, which had held back Roman legions and served as Germany's western defense for 2 millennia, had been breached at multiple points in less than a month. Eisenhower's assessment captured the magnitude of the achievement. "We were across the Rhine on a permanent bridge," he wrote in his memoirs. The traditional defensive barrier to the heart of Germany had been pierced. The final defeat of the enemy, which we had long calculated would occur in the spring and summer campaigning of 1945, was suddenly now just around the corner. This American assessment was echoed by observers from other nations. War correspondents declared that the war had been shortened by months. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose meticulously planned Operation Plunder Rhine crossing had been overshadowed by the American success at Remagen, acknowledged the strategic significance. Soviet commanders, watching the rapid Allied advance from the east, accelerated their own operations to ensure they would reach Berlin first. The race for Germany had become a sprint, and the starting gun had been fired at Remagen. German military authorities offered varying estimates of how much the loss of the bridge had shortened the war. Some claimed weeks, others months. The truth, however, was that precise calculations were impossible because the strategic effects were systemic, not linear. The capture of the bridge had not only advanced the Allied timetable, but had fundamentally altered German strategic options. Before Remagen, German commanders could imagine holding the Rhine through April or possibly May. using that time to reinforce defenses around Berlin and negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies, allowing them to focus on the Soviet threat. After Remagen, such calculations became pure fantasy. The Rhine had fallen 3 weeks ahead of schedule. German reserves that should have been used to defend against Montgomery's northern crossing had been exhausted in futile attempts to eliminate the Remagen bridgehead. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. Colonel F. Russell Lyons, the 3rd Corps engineer, whose men had captured and held the bridge, estimated that having an intact bridge saved the Allies 2 months of fighting and 35,000 casualties. This calculation compared the Remagen crossing to the amphibious operations required at other Rhine crossing points. At Wesel, where Montgomery's Operation Plunder unfolded, the British and Americans assembled over 200 artillery pieces, conducted elaborate airborne drops, and suffered substantial casualties despite overwhelming superiority. At Remagen, American forces crossed with minimal casualties because the bridge eliminated the need for assault boats, which were the most vulnerable phase of any river crossing. Historian Ken Hecker, who conducted extensive post-war interviews with participants from both sides, concluded that the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge materially hastened the war's end. Other historians suggested that the capture shortened the war by approximately 6 months. The variations in estimates reflected different methodologies and assumptions, but the consensus was clear. Remagen had been a turning point. The human cost of the bridge's capture and defense provides another measure of its significance. American casualties in the Battle of Remagen and subsequent fighting in the bridgehead totaled approximately 860 killed, nearly 5,700 wounded, and an equal number missing. These were heavy losses, but they were concentrated in the first 18 days of fighting. From March 7th to March 25th, German casualties in the same period exceeded 11,700 prisoners alone, with killed and wounded numbers never accurately tallied, but certainly exceeding 10,000. The disparity reflected the fundamental imbalance of forces. The Americans had air superiority, artillery superiority, armored superiority, and the psychological advantage of knowing they were winning. The Germans had orders to counterattack, but they could not fulfill them. Equipment that was breaking down, and the growing certainty that the war was lost. The executions of the German officers responsible for losing the bridge cast a dark shadow over the military's honor code. Major Hans Scheller, a 31-year-old career officer who had served with distinction on both the Eastern and Western fronts, had been married and had young children he would never see grow up. His crime was arriving at the bridge only 2 hours before it was overrun. The officers who were captured and failed to perform miracles with only 36 exhausted. Soldiers against several thousand. Americans, supported by tanks and artillery, were unfairly blamed. Lieutenant Karl, a technical specialist, had been trying to save secret equipment from capture. His execution occurred despite testimony that he had acted according to standing orders to protect advanced technology. Majors Kraft and Strobel had followed standard procedures for preparing demolition charges. None of these 4 men deserved to die. All were scapegoats for a system that had collapsed from the top down. After the war, General Lieutenant Rudolf Hübner, who conducted the flying court-martial, was tried by German courts and sentenced to 4 years in prison for his role in the illegal executions. While this was a modest sentence for judicial murder, it acknowledged that even in Germany's darkest hour, some officers recognized the trials as a travesty. The final assessment of Remagen's significance must also include its role in the Allied strategic debate about how to end the war. Before Remagen, there had been serious discussions about whether to halt at the Rhine and let the Soviets bear the brunt of the final assault on Germany. Some British and American planners argued that crossing the Rhine would be costly, and that Soviet forces attacking from the east could achieve the same objective with fewer Western casualties. Remagen made that debate irrelevant. With American forces already across the Rhine and expanding their bridgehead, halting no longer made strategic sense. Momentum had to be maintained. The rapid advance from the Rhine to the Elbe, accomplished in just over a month, vindicated that decision. American forces met Soviet troops at Torgau on April 25th, effectively cutting Germany in two. By May 8th, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The capture of the bridge had repercussions beyond the immediate military situation. In the United States, news of the capture reached the Senate while in session. The leadership suspended its usual rule against applause, and senators stood to cheer. Newspapers across America ran headlines proclaiming that the end of the war in Europe was in sight. War bond sales surged. The psychological impact on American public morale was profound. After years of war and tens of thousands of casualties, victory was finally within reach. In Germany, news of the bridge's loss spread quickly, deeply demoralizing the military and civilian population. Germans had been told by propaganda that the Rhine was impregnable, that the Allies would break themselves against its defenses. The discovery that the Rhine had been crossed almost casually, that a single bridge had remained intact due to a combination of American luck and German dysfunction, destroyed whatever faith remained in the regime's competence. The physical remains of the Ludendorff Bridge tell their own story. After the war, the structure was not rebuilt. The twisted steel and broken stone were cleared from the river, but the towers on both banks remained standing. The western towers were eventually converted into a peace museum. The Friedens Museum in Remagen now traces the bridge's history, from its construction to its destruction, with special focus on the March 1945 battle and its consequences. The eastern towers are now used as a performing arts space. The contrast between their wartime and peacetime uses is deliberate, symbolizing how destruction can give way to creation. The soldiers who captured the bridge received recognition commensurate with their achievement. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. Sergeant Alex Drabik received the same decoration. Dozens of other soldiers from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 14th Tank Battalion received Silver Stars and Bronze Stars. Brigadier General William Hogue was promoted and received command of a corps. The entire 9th Armored Division received a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions at Remagen. These awards recognized individual and collective bravery, but they couldn't capture the full significance of what had been accomplished. The men who crossed the bridge under fire had not just secured a tactical objective. They had participated in a moment that changed the trajectory of the war. Every day the war was shortened, saved thousands of lives, both military and civilian. The soldiers who fought at Remagen directly contributed to that outcome. The Remagen story raises profound questions about the role of chance in history. If the fog had not lifted when it did, would American scouts have found the bridge before it was blown? If the electrical detonation system had functioned properly, would the bridge have been destroyed with American troops on it? If Major Scheller had arrived 2 hours earlier, could he have organized a defense to delay the Americans? If Hitler had not ordered the removal of explosives after the Cologne incident, would the Remagen charges have been properly installed and functional? Each of these questions suggests a different outcome, a history where the bridge was destroyed and the Rhine crossing proceeded according to the original Allied timetable. The accumulation of contingencies that led to the bridge's capture suggests that history is not deterministic and that individual decisions and random events can produce consequences far beyond what anyone anticipated. The final assessment must return to the human element. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was the result of men acting under extreme stress and danger. Lieutenant Timmermann led his company across a bridge that could explode at any moment. Sergeant Drabik sprinted toward the eastern bank, while German machine guns fired at him. The combat engineers worked under fire to disarm demolition charges. Tank crews provided covering fire from the western bank. Staff officers recognized the opportunity and made the decision to seize it. Commanders redirected entire armies to exploit the breakthrough. Every person in this chain made choices that influenced the outcome. Remove any single link, and the result could have been different. This recognition of individual agency within larger historical forces is what makes the story compelling. The men at Remagen were not mere pawns of historical inevitability, but active participants who shaped events through their courage and decisions. The 80th anniversary of the bridge's capture in March 2025 was marked by ceremonies in both Remagen and the United States. Veterans organizations, historical societies, and military units tracing their lineage to the 9th Armored Division took part in events honoring the soldiers who fought there. The German government acknowledged the battle's significance while emphasizing the lessons about the costs of war and the value of peace. The commemorations reflected the complex legacy of the event. For Americans, it was a moment of triumph, a validation of courage and decisive leadership. For Germans, it was a reminder of defeat, but also of liberation from Nazism. For historians, it was a case study of how contingency and determinism interact in warfare. For all participants, it was a reminder that individual decisions made in moments of crisis can shape the course of history. The men who captured the bridge at Remagen could not have known that their actions would become the subject of books, films, and academic studies. They were soldiers doing their duty in circumstances none of them would have chosen. That their duty led to outcomes of world historical significance is a testament to the unpredictable nature of war and the enduring importance of courage.